Hello students! Today we're going to be talking about the article you were reading for class this week and really emphasize and talk about weird participants. So weird is an acronym, W-I-E-R-D, assuming I spelt that right, or some other combination of those letters. So let's talk about the participants we use in most psychology studies. And that's what this article was about, and it was not the first to talk about this, but it's one of the more popular ones to really bring this issue to the forefront. Since then, we kind of call this topic talking about weird participants, and you'll see why in a second. So let's get going. This slide, I thought I deleted it. It's not needed there. Anyway, so who are the neglected 95% that it talks about in this article? So the neglected 95% is really referring to the 95% of people in the world that aren't really represented in psychology studies. So most of the world's population has not been, up to the point of writing this article, had not really been included in psychology studies. It was very Western focused, but even more than that, really focused on US participants and specifically about middle class participants, and even more than that, college age white men. So that's a really small segment of the world population. And granted, there's more than just that, but it really has been very US focused. So with that, most psych samples are USA based. Most are made exclusively of people from the USA, and that is only a small portion of the world's population. So the concern is, well, are we not actually understanding basic psychological truths of humans? Are we really only finding things out about people from the US? So with that, the US population is only about 5% of the world population. And so with that, just a quick reminder, population is like the entire world population is a population, right? So you can think about what is the percentage of ethnicities across all people in the world population. Or you could look at the ethnicity of all the people in the US population if you were using the US as your population. You could use the Salt Lake Community College as your population, like the entirety of the people you're interested in. Now your sample is a subset of that population, your group that you are studying. So if your population is the entirety of the world, hopefully you have kind of a randomly selected sample from the entirety of the world population, and probably a pretty big number of people too, to get a good representative sample of the world population. A US sample, still going to be a really large group of people, but just from the population of the USA. And then if you were looking at the population of Salt Lake Community College, you might pick 40 people in each major across Salt Lake Community College. That would be your sample. So again, population is everybody in the group. Sample is your group that you are studying, so a smaller subset of that group. All right, so what did this study do? They analyzed 6 APA published journals. As we know from previous chapters, there are many more than just 6 APA journals, but they picked some of the biggest ones, so Developmental Psychology, JPSP, Journal of Abnormal Psych, Journal of Family Psychology, Health Psychology, and Journal of Educational Psychology. So, a couple different journals. Maybe one of those sounds more interesting than the others to you. Developmental Psych, I put that at the top of the list. It was either alphabetical in the article or that one's my favorite, so that's why I put it at the top of the list. So these are all journals that are published by the APA. So journal articles looking like this. Here's a picture of the actual journals. Like if you got the print journals, you might actually see these if you go near the psych offices. There's often old copies of journal articles and textbooks, old textbooks out for grabs, where I usually do my work in the what's the building called? AAB building at the Taylorsville campus. Anyway, there's often many journals, old journals there. I use most of my journals just online. With that being said, so these researchers, they analyzed those journals for the previous 20 years. And they just looked at the number of these authors and the journals themselves and the samples, who were from the USA, who were not. So 73% of the first authors were from the US. So first author is supposed to be the person who did the most work writing the paper. So if I wrote with two other people in a group, if I wrote, let's say, 50% of the paper and the other two, they both worked on 25%, so we wrote about that much, I would probably be the first author there on that paper. Usually that's what first author means. Whoever either had the idea or started the project, started the paper, did the most work on the paper, something like that would be the deciding factor of who is the first author. Then 74% of the other authors, so whether it was second, third, fourth authors, 74% of them were from the USA. So about 75% of the authorship were from the USA. The samples themselves, about 68% were from the USA. And ethnicity was not always reported, so it wasn't possible in every case to be able to determine where the samples came from. But with that, 77% were European Americans, so either from Europe or the US, and then about 67% of the population in these samples were college undergrads. And so again, this was analyzing data from the journals 20 years before this paper was released. So since this time, since this was brought to the attention of psychology, we've done a better job, but this is really where psychology started at. Looking at college undergrads. Even before that, looking at white male college undergrads. So that's a really specific piece of the population. So what are the differences that the paper points out between US population and samples around the world? Well, just think of any differences that might matter. Think of the models that we've seen of how different things affect other things. So bioecological systems theory. What are the systems that are biggest there? Society and culture. So you might be in a developed versus developing country. So different countries have different economic systems. Different countries have different political systems. Different countries might have schooling that is mandatory or funded past a certain point that the US doesn't have, or before a certain point in the US. So there's different levels of schooling, different schooling expected before jumping into a career. Gender gaps might be larger or smaller depending on the country that we're looking at. Life expectancies are going to be different around the world. So life expectancies in 2004 around the world were anywhere between 63 years and 76 years. In 2020, the worldwide life expectancy was 72 years. So with this, other things that are different are family systems. Most people worldwide outside the US tend to have larger families living in one house. Also, most people around the world tend to live closer to their extended family, where in some cultures it might be literally your next door neighbor or like your cousins, and you might be living in the same home as your grandparents. So this is this is really the norm around the world, and this is something that child developmental psychologists talk about a lot, actually, because that's a big cultural difference. When you have so many family members in such close proximity with a child, there's so many more people that could be resources for the child, is one thing that's very different from the US. So there might be other cultural differences as well. So there's a very wide variety of expected community participation and civic engagements. Some countries have very little community engagement expected within their cultures and countries. Some have a lot of community engagement that's expected within their cultures. So with that, whenever talking about family systems, it's very tangential, but it reminds me of the song by my favorite band that's called Family System. So feel free to click on that link in the slides if you want to listen to that song. I think that's from their second album. And they've had a lot of albums since then, so listen to some of their newer stuff. Their most recent album is definitely my favorite of theirs. Anyway, again, not relevant, but anytime I'm mentioning those words, family systems, it primes their song in my mind, and I will probably listen to them as I'm uploading this video after recording it. So with that, again, cultural differences, wide variety of community participation expected. So let's watch a little video and we'll talk throughout it on weird participants. And it basically follows along with this idea. Again, this research was published. This video actually talks a little bit about this research paper that you read, but now we talk about it in a slightly different way, kind of pinpointing some of the key differences between samples from the US and samples from the rest of the world. Let's make sure my volume is up.
Psychology is the study of human behavior and the mind. So it's easy to imagine that researchers are trying to learn universal truths, but humans come in a lot of different flavors. So we can't make sweeping predictions about all of humanity based on the limited populations that are usually used in psychology research. In fact, many subjects may actually be psychological outliers. So we should be careful about jumping to conclusions about what makes humans tick. See, most research subjects in behavioral sciences, which include psychology, economics, and cognitive science, belong to what's called the WEIRD population. Coined by researchers in 2010, WEIRD is an acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic.
There we go. So, I do think I spelled it wrong, weird, at the beginning of this lecture, but that's okay. So those are what this acronym stands for. So it's really pinpointing some of the problems we're talking about already, that the Western culture is going to be different than other cultures specifically. That the samples that we're usually getting in the US, like we saw there, it was like 67% were college students, college undergraduate. So that's more educated than is necessarily the case in every other country around the world. An undergraduate degree is in many ways kind of expected in the US, but that's not necessarily the expectation worldwide. Industrialized, so we have industry here that is not everywhere within the world. Rich, on average, are so maybe not at each individual person, but the median income level for people in the US is much higher than people worldwide. Then democratic, so there's a democratic system of voting. So what that means is essentially people in some way are picking their representatives. So is what it's talking about here. It's not saying specifically any specific system. It's just one of the examples of a democratic system is what we have here. And that's not the same case in everywhere within the world. So because of these differences, the samples that we're using in psychology might have significant differences to samples across the world. So thinking back to the bioecological systems theory, when we have those top levels, the biggest circles in that systems theory and those models that we've been looking at in the class a few times, like when we're talking about theories, when we have such a different, broader culture and systems around us, that's going to have other impacts on like how a parent might interact with a child, or parents interact with other parents, or a school system, different expectations for school systems. And so the things that we're looking at in psychology, while every single result we find might not be able to translate to every single culture, some things might, right? So if we look at something we've mentioned before, how the brain creates memories, probably going to be the same whether you're a weird participant or not, right? But we do need to do the science to investigate, is that the case? Does this thing hold up in culture A, B, C, D? And if it holds up in enough different cultures, we can say this is probably something we can expect worldwide. But that was one thing, is for a while, psychology was very focused only on these weird participants. And one of the things we're doing today is talking about how to have good methods by not only including weird participants. So that's one of the big points of this lecture.
These subgroups are more likely to have the resources and educational systems to support academic research, but it means that the studies that they publish can be really skewed. For example, in 2008, a study of more than 4,000 articles published over...
So this is literally citing the Arnett article that you read. So that's... Some of the next facts come from the Arnett article, some of them are additional studies.
20 years, found that around 95% of behavioral science research subjects come from the US, Europe, and English-speaking countries like Australia. But these countries only make up about 12% of the world's population.
So again, we mentioned that only it was what the US makes only about 5% of the world's population. If you then extrapolate that to Europe and Australia, then you can call it like 12%. But still, pretty small proportion in comparison to 100% of people across the world.
The same analysis found that 68% of subjects are from the United States, and more than 2/3 of American psychology research subjects are undergraduate students. So another review in 2010 looked at dozens of studies in the behavioral sciences and concluded something that seems kind of obvious, but it's worth saying. American college students aren't representative of all humans. They're actually a pretty unusual subgroup, so they were given the acronym WEIRD. Like, take the W in WEIRD. As one example, research has found that Western subjects tend to report having higher self-esteem than many non-Western subjects. Some scientists have pointed out that this might just reflect how different cultures value things like modesty. This could affect how people describe themselves, but not how they actually feel.
So this goes back to what we were just talking about, the systems around us affecting how we are living and experiencing our lives, developing and changing, the way we perceive things around us. All of these are affected by the models. I should just pull it up really quick. Actually, I am going to do that really quickly. I'm going to pause the video and pull one up. All right, I'm back. I found a couple good examples of this model. So again, this is the bioecological systems theory. So the Chronos system, that is time. The time in the environment that we're in within our course in time. We move through time as well. Unless you're the doctor, then you can move through different times. So with that, macro system, culture, so that's one of the biggest, broadest things. And so this, you see these little arrows, are affecting the things inside it. So the exosystem, it's your family, your neighbors, your microsystem, so extended family, so not people that you are seeing on a day-to-day basis. The microsystem are those people or those things that you're interacting with daily or like on a weekly basis. So you probably see members of your family, certain friends. You might go to a church, you might go to a school, you might have neighborhood activities you do, you might have parks that you go to. These are all within your microsystem. So it has child here, but this developmental model works past childhood as well. So a person is being affected and affecting those systems. So the developmental systems meta theory is essentially another way to look at this, just another model to look at this, where you still have these big broad things like culture, society, and your community, and it's kind of taking a more focused approach of looking at an individual and their bidirectional interaction. So how a child impacts the parents impact the child. So when we're thinking about samples from the US versus any other culture that's slightly different or dramatically different or anything in between, some of these effects might be different because of these different effects that the cultures have on the perception of things or how things are taught or what's expected for schools. So we can't just take it for granted that the findings that we have here in the US with a college sample are going to be the same as people in another country. So you just can't take that for granted, is essentially what these papers, the Arnett paper, this paper that they're talking about here in the video about WEIRD participants, we can't take that for granted. So what do we do about it? The video will go to a couple other problems with the assumption that they might be the same too, before talking about solutions.
And even within the same country or region, people aren't the same. Just looking at a typical American psychology subject, an undergrad student, compared to most Americans, reveals some differences in self-perception, ethics, and economic decision-making. For instance, researchers compared a bunch of studies on the ultimatum game, which is a financial sharing and decision-making task that was designed for psychology and economics experiments. Specifically, they were looking at the E in the WEIRD acronym to understand how people in college made money decisions in this game, and whether those results could be generalized to all people. And they found that undergrads are more likely to offer less money to another person compared to American adults who aren't currently, and may have never been, college students. So even just within the US economy, it's important to recognize that the typical research subject's behavior doesn't really tell you about how the typical person manages money.
I wanted those words still on there for us. All right, so that's a good example to show that, yeah, it might be a little more obvious that, yes, a culture here in the US is different than a culture somewhere else in the world. But even within the US, we see there are these kind of cultural and contextual differences. So, more recent research since this time has taken more steps to do a better job. And that's kind of the end point of this video, but I think how we've described it here probably is good enough. So, hopefully you understand neglected 95%, weird participants. First, this paper came out talking about the neglected 95%. Later on, the term weird participants came into the discussion, but it's really talking about this same potential problem. So let's talk about some possible solutions. So right now, before going any further in the video, pause this video and write down a few things that you remember. What were some potential solutions to this problem? All right, hopefully you did pause and write down at least one idea of a potential solution for this problem, because we do want to understand both in any individual community, how can we best help this person? But we also want to understand in all communities, what can we do to understand and use psychology to help all people? So it is useful to focus down on this specific community. Like, how can we help this specific city within this specific cultural context with these different ethnicities, with these different programs that are available here? How can we help in this specific place? As well as think about how can we help in this specific place, in a completely different city, in a completely different country. So what are some solutions here? Well, one, for the journals themselves, include editors that are not from the USA. So we saw that a lot of the authors, a lot of the papers were from the US. If we include editors who are not from the US, they will know things about their own cultures. Maybe we can have them even emphasize or have special issues about their specific cultures as well. So special issues emphasizing writings from non-US authors and samples more regularly. And these are really recommendations for APA published journals, which it makes sense that the APA published journals are getting in US psychology participants and authors because it's American Psychology Association. But since it is one of the biggest organizations in psychology in the world, it really behooves them to do a better job looking at cross-cultural psychology. So having special issues where you focus on having non-US authors, non-US editors. Also, the APA system, it was recommended in the article to have a system of mentoring. So help people from other cultures learn how to write in APA format. So you're going through the process in this class as we're writing our papers on learning how to write in APA format. It's really nice to have a standardized way to write because then it makes it easier to find research and understand the research. Whereas if you're writing in another format, it just takes out a little more cognitive energy. So it's really useful to have this system, but if someone doesn't know how to write in APA format, it's going to keep them out of applying to write submitting their papers to an APA journal. So another thing that can be done is undergrad programs should require at least 2 courses focused on culture. So to get more detail, because we're talking about it here, we're mentioning that there are ways that culture can be important, but this isn't a cultural focused class. Even my developmental classes, I might mention a few specific aspects of culture when it comes to like aging or care of children or adolescent interventions and care, but it's not a culture focused program. So having more courses focused specifically on cultural differences and cross-cultural psychology could be really, really useful to everybody in the programs. So this could be even coming from an anthropology course, a specific cultural psych course, cultural sociology courses. So it doesn't have to be within a psych program. Like having a cultural psych makes sense to be under the psych program banner. But if you had a cultural anthropology course, that could fit the bill as well and help. So even having study abroad could help a lot too, seeing another culture and actually studying literally in another culture. Many of the study abroad programs that are connected to programs in the US are still with weird participants, generally more Western cultures, industrialized, rich, those kinds of things. So another thing is that funding agencies like the NIH could emphasize samples outside the USA. So this doesn't go just for NIH. This can be any funding agency, any private funders. There are private funding organizations that use the money from a family to pay for different research that they think might be valuable, essentially. So they say, hey, so me as an author and a researcher, I would submit a grant application. I would say, hey, I want to study pro-social behavior. I want to study how I can help adolescents take more action in their community or something like that. I have a tool that might help them. Will you give me this much money so I can study it over the next 3 years? So these organizations can say, hey, that's a really great idea, but you're required to do this in a culture outside the US or US and another culture at the same time. They could make those kind of stipulations to encourage more of this work being done outside the US. And even making connections, having connections with other funding agencies or private agencies within other places to help researchers make connections between people in other cultures. So with that, think of any other solutions that weren't mentioned. If we were in an actual classroom setting, I'd have you sit down and write more. But one of the biggest things is to do this cross-cultural psychology work. So just like I mentioned, a funding institution could make the requirement, hey, you also have to do that work in another culture. But me, I'm currently living in Utah in the US. I might have no connections outside the US culture, right? So what we have to do as psychologists is work with people on the ground in that culture that you're wanting to investigate. So I've done different lab projects with people connected to Liberia, different areas in China, Mexico. But with these, in each of those specific cases, I haven't spoke the language, the primary language that the people there spoke. So what I relied on was communicating with another researcher or another practitioner. Like in some of these cases, it was a person running a youth program in that location that had read some of the research that our lab had worked on and wanted some input, wanted to test it in that culture. In some of these other cases, it was academics from those countries that contacted and they're like, hey, do you want to collaborate? Or I heard you at a research conference. Do you want to try that too in this culture? So with that, that's one of the biggest things. Obviously, some of you students, you have connections between already, maybe family, maybe you yourself lived in another culture and now you're living here in the US for these classes and then you're going to go back. So you might already have a ton of connections, family even, there in that culture. But a big thing is make sure you're working with people who are in that culture, who are experiencing the things and have knowledge of those experiences. Because you in your own upbringing and development and the systems you've been in might be very drastically different, or they might not be, but you won't know until you start having conversations with these people and trying to plan out studies, evaluations, interventions, things like that. So with that, network, make connections with people, and work together. So it should be a collaborative effort with people who are in those cultures. It shouldn't be me, some white guy, coming to some other country and dictating this is exactly how the best way it's been done in the past, this is how you should do it, taking some measurements, and then heading back out of there. No, I should work with people who are already doing things, who have already done some work in that area, and collaborate with them. And that's the key thing, a lack of hierarchy here with these people. So you might bring certain skills, but they're bringing other skills too. So you've got to work together. So one thing that's important to remember is language and translation services. So even measurement tools, survey measures that I use really frequently here in the US, they might not be read or understood the same way in another language. So translating them, then having it back translated. So that's essentially, I would translate my survey into, let's say, Spanish, and then having someone else, so a different translator, translate it back from Spanish to English, so I can get a sense of, is it actually saying what I want, talking to people who are bilingual, having them read the Spanish version to make sure it's actually getting at the points I want the survey measure to get at. Then even validating it in that new sample. So seeing if my pro-social behavior measure, does it actually get at pro-social behavior in this new cultural context? Because if it doesn't, then using that tool to measure is just like using the tape measure to measure someone's smile. It's really not a useful tool. So pre-assess those measures in new cultures, especially after you've translated them to new languages. Talk to people, work with people from other cultures. If you already are from that culture, then great. You can be working there and collaborating with other people and probably do a better job than I would do, who has basically no other cultural experience. But that's why it's so important to do this kind of work with the people who have the expertise, and you can match up skills well to learn more about things cross-culturally. So cross-cultural psych is not just I'll get to that point in a second. Cross-cultural psych is not just testing to see, hey, this happened in the US sample. Is this the way it works in a cross-cultural sample? It can be. That can be what happens, but also you can use your skills and research methods to help them answer questions that they have. So it's interesting to see the background of different research themes in the area of, say, moral development, for example, seeing how things came from different philosophers, even different religions, and how different cultures have come to some of the same ideas in different ways and call them different things. But without taking a look at those things, you wouldn't know those things. So, with that, funding organizations, there are some that specifically fund cross-cultural psychology work. So the only way you're going to get funding from those organizations is by doing something cross-cultural between 2 or 3 cultures, and that can be really useful. And it's also an area where there's a lot more of these funding, because we realize as people in the sciences that that's needed so much to understand the world of psychology, so psychology of everybody in the world. There's a lot more of these funding agencies available to go to for funding. So if you're doing cross-cultural psych work, there are avenues to pay for that. All right, and it's also a good way that, since these organizations do tend to fund cross-cultural psych, if you want to work in a specific culture, you might say, hey, I need some help. I need some help in this culture. I don't have experience here. Can you connect me with some researchers or practitioners on the ground who I could talk with? And you can do that at conferences as well. You can email researchers who you've read their papers of, things like that. There's ways to get connected with people, but it will take that networking, and then remember, working together. All right, so that is what we know about the neglected 95%, the weird participants of psychology, and steps forward to do a better job at investigating psychology across the world. That's been the focus of this lesson. I don't want to end on this point, but it might be the end, that it's okay to focus just on any given sample within the US as well. There's, like we said, even different cultures within the US. So if your research interest is one specific area, it's fine to do that research. But also we've got to remember the big picture of the field of psychology. If we're trying to understand how humans behave, how humans process things, how humans feel and experience things, we need to look at humans worldwide. So let's do a better job at that. We've done better since these papers have come out, but there's still a lot of steps we can take to do even better in the future.